The sharp chime of the cabin announcement system barely masked the growing tension. Inside the luxurious private jet, where crystal glasses clinked softly against polished wooden tables, an uncomfortable silence spread like a slow-moving storm. Amelia Hunt, the lead flight attendant, stood in the aisle, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping a leather-bound passenger manifest. Her eyes locked onto one woman seated near the front, Sophie Caldwell. Unlike the other travelers, who lounged in their seats with an air of practiced entitlement, Sophie sat with quiet confidence, her dark eyes calmly meeting Amelia's gaze. A muscle twitched in Amelia's jaw. Something about Sophie didn't fit the picture. The tailored navy blue pantsuit, the understated but clearly expensive jewelry. Everything about her was elegant yet off. Amelia had spent years perfecting the art of reading people, deciding within seconds who deserved her best service and who didn't. And Sophie, she wasn't on that list. A few rows back, a man in a golf sweater leaned in to whisper something to his wife. The woman, draped in pearls, glanced at Sophie with mild curiosity before returning to her glass of Chardonnay. Amelia stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the plush carpet. "Ma'am," she said, voice dipped in that particular kind of politeness reserved for people she had no patience for. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to the back of the plane." The words landed like a dropped fork in a quiet restaurant. A subtle but undeniable shift rippled through the cabin. Heads turned. A man pretending to scroll through his phone paused. Sophie tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether she'd misheard. "I'm sorry?" Her voice was steady, controlled. Amelia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "This section is reserved for our premium guests." Silence. Sophie didn't flinch, she didn't fidget. Instead, she reached for the armrest, crossing one leg over the other with effortless grace. "I believe my ticket places me right here," she said evenly. The businessman across the aisle, who had been half watching the confrontation, suddenly became very interested. He wasn't the only one. Amelia let out a quiet, clipped breath. "I don't think so," she countered. "Perhaps you made a mistake when booking." A pause. Then Sophie leaned back slightly, studying the woman in front of her. "Perhaps," she mused, "you should check the list before making assumptions." That did it. Amelia's professional mask didn't crack, but something shifted in her expression. A flicker of irritation, quickly masked by feigned patience. "I don't need to check anything. I know who belongs in this section and who doesn't." A single breath passed. A woman further down the cabin, a socialite with a perfectly coiffed bob, exchanged a look with her companion. "Oh dear," she murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is embarrassing. She should just move." Another passenger, a man in a tailored suit, shook his head slightly, disapproving but unwilling to intervene. Sophie's lips parted as if she might respond, but then she didn't. Instead, she reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out her phone, and typed something quickly before setting it back down. The action was simple, quiet, and it sent a sliver of unease crawling up Amelia's spine. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin. "Either you move, or I'll have security escort you off this plane," she announced, voice just loud enough for the watching passengers to hear. The businessman raised an eyebrow. The socialite smirked. "And Sophie?" She simply exhaled slowly, tapping a single manicured nail against the armrest before looking Amelia dead in the eye. "Call whoever you need to," she said. "I'm not moving." The silence that followed wasn't just awkward, it was electric. The tension in the cabin thickened like humid air before a thunderstorm. Amelia's fingers curled slightly around the manifest, her knuckles turning white. This was supposed to be simple. One firm instruction, one obedient passenger, and the issue would disappear. Yet Sophie remained unmoved, her presence unsettling in its quiet defiance. Passengers were now fully invested, some pretending to ignore the confrontation while subtly angling their bodies to watch. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. A younger flight attendant, Lily, hovered nearby, her expression hesitant. She shifted on her feet, glancing at Amelia as if weighing the consequences of speaking up. Amelia's patience wore thin. "I'm not going to ask again," she said, keeping her voice measured but firm. "Move to the back, or I will personally ensure you don't fly with this airline again." Sophie exhaled through her nose, a hint of amusement flickering across her face. She picked up her phone again, tapped something, and set it down. The gesture was subtle, effortless, but it sent another ripple of unease through Amelia's chest. Lily cleared her throat. "Maybe we should check." Amelia silenced her with a sharp look. "No need," she snapped. "She doesn't belong here." The businessman's brow furrowed at the choice of words. His gaze flickered between Amelia and Sophie, his curiosity deepening into something else, something resembling recognition. A few rows back, the socialite from earlier smirked, whispering to her friend. She's obviously trying to get a free upgrade. Can't blame her for trying. Another passenger, an older gentleman with salt and pepper hair, sighed audibly. This is ridiculous. Just check the list and be done with it. The murmurs grew louder, and for the first time, Amelia sensed the tide shifting. She was losing control of the narrative. Sophie finally moved, not to stand, but to adjust her seatbelt. You've already made a mistake, she said calmly. Are you sure you want to make another one? Her voice was steady, almost conversational, but the weight behind it made Amelia's pulse spike. Excuse me? You assume you have the authority here, Sophie said, meeting Amelia's glare with unnerving ease. You don't. The businessman's fingers tapped against the armrest, his expression unreadable. Lily looked like she wanted to disappear. Amelia inhaled sharply, feeling the pressure of watching eyes. She turned, striding toward the cockpit with controlled fury. If this woman wanted to play games, she'd bring in the pilot. The businessman shifted in his seat, exhaling through his nose. Oh, she's in trouble, he muttered under his breath. Sophie didn't react. She simply waited. Amelia marched down the aisle, her heels striking the carpet with sharp precision. The watching passengers quickly averted their gazes, pretending to return to their drinks, phones, and hushed conversations. But the tension clung to the air, thick and undeniable. Sophie remained seated, perfectly still. Her fingers rested lightly on the armrest, her posture betraying no sign of agitation. If anything, she looked patient, as if waiting for the inevitable. Lily hesitated near the galley, shifting her weight between her feet. Her lips parted slightly, as if she might say something, but she quickly reconsidered. Amelia was on a warpath, and anyone who got in the way would be collateral damage. Inside the cockpit, the pilot, Captain Howard Bennett, sat reviewing flight coordinates. He glanced up as Amelia stormed in, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He had flown long enough to recognize that look. This wasn't about safety. This was about control. We've got a problem, Amelia said, placing her hands on her hips. Howard set his pen down. What kind of problem? There's a passenger refusing to move. She's in the wrong section, and I've given her multiple chances to comply. She's making a scene. Howard leaned back slightly, rubbing his temple. And you're sure she's not supposed to be there? Amelia's jaw tightened. I know who belongs up front and who doesn't. Howard didn't like that answer. He reached for the manifest, scanning the list. A long pause. Then his forehead creased. Sophie Caldwell, he murmured under his breath. His eyes flicked back to Amelia, sharp with something close to disbelief. You're telling me she's the problem? Amelia's stomach dropped slightly. There was something in his tone that set off alarm bells. Yes, she pressed. She's being difficult. We need to remove her before takeoff. Howard exhaled through his nose, carefully placing the manifest on the console. Then, without a word, he stood. Amelia followed as he stepped into the cabin. The murmurs quieted as passengers sensed the shift. The captain's presence changed the energy, his uniform, his authority, the unspoken finality of his decisions. Sophie looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. Howard stopped beside her seat, scanning her face for a moment before nodding once. Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice calm but firm. Is there a problem? Sophie tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth lifting in something that wasn't quite a smile. Not on my end. Howard turned to Amelia, his voice dropping to something only she could hear. I suggest you step away from this one. Amelia's pulse quickened. Captain, do you have any idea who she is? Howard cut her off, his tone low and clipped. Amelia swallowed hard, suddenly aware that the entire cabin was watching, waiting. A few passengers exchanged glances, sensing something big about to unfold. Sophie remained silent, letting the weight of the moment settle. And then, just like that, Amelia realized she had lost. Amelia's throat tightened as the captain's words sank in. Do you have any idea who she is? The question clung to the air, heavy and unshakable. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Every instinct screamed at her to double down, to demand Sophie move, to insist she was right. But something about the captain's tone told her that would be a grave mistake. Passengers watched with bated breath. Some glanced at one another as if waiting for someone to explain what was happening. The businessman across the aisle leaned back in his seat, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had figured it out. Sophie didn't move, Didn't gloat, didn't need to. She simply waited, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. Howard exhaled slowly, leveling Amelia with a pointed look before turning back to Sophie. Miss Caldwell, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding. His voice carried the smooth control of someone trying to mitigate disaster before it spiraled further. Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. Sophie nodded once, accepting the apology but offering nothing more. The businessman finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the silence. Well, he said, setting his drink down with deliberate ease, that just got interesting. A few passengers chuckled nervously, but the tension still crackled in the air. Amelia's mind raced. She had been so certain, so confident in her judgment. Now, the very ground beneath her authority had shifted. Howard took a step back, giving Amelia space to absorb the moment. Then, turning to the rest of the cabin, he spoke with the calm authority of someone bringing an incident to a close. There's been a misunderstanding, but we're moving forward now. His tone left no room for discussion. Let's all settle in. We'll be departing shortly. Murmurs of curiosity flickered through the cabin, but no one dared to push further. Amelia stood frozen, her heart pounding. And Sophie? She simply picked up her phone, tapped the screen once, and let the moment pass. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, but it was there, a quiet, undeniable change in energy. The murmurs had faded, but the tension still lingered, thick and waiting to settle. Amelia stood stiffly near the cockpit, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat in front of her. The warmth in her cheeks told her exactly what had happened. She had miscalculated, badly. Sophie, on the other hand, remained perfectly composed. She hadn't gloated, hadn't pushed back, hadn't even acknowledged Amelia's presence since the captain had spoken. That, more than anything, sent an uneasy knot twisting in Amelia's stomach. Howard had returned to the cockpit without another word. Whatever conversation needed to happen between him and Sophie, it had already passed, and Amelia had been left completely out of it. That fact burned. She took a slow breath, willing her hands to stop trembling. With practiced ease, she smoothed down her uniform, forcing herself back into the calm, collected version of herself that had controlled this cabin for years. If she lost her composure now, she would lose everything. Passengers were still watching her, not all of them, not obviously, but enough. The businessman across the aisle had that same smug smirk, his gaze flickering between Sophie and Amelia, like he was watching a game unfold, already knowing the outcome. Amelia turned sharply on her heel, striding toward the galley. She needed a moment to think. Lily was already there, standing near the beverage cart, her posture tight and uncertain. The younger flight attendant had stayed silent during the exchange, but her expression now told Amelia everything she needed to know. She had seen the shift in power, too. Forcing a cool smile, Amelia reached for a glass and poured herself a small amount of water. "Make sure first class has everything they need," she said, her voice crisp, unaffected. Lily hesitated, her fingers tapping lightly against the cart. Then cautiously, she spoke. "Amelia, maybe we should have just checked." The words were soft, careful, but they landed like a slap. Amelia's grip on the glass tightened. "Excuse me?" Lily glanced toward the cabin, then back at Amelia. "I mean, if she had a ticket for that seat, then—" Amelia set the glass down a little too hard. The quiet clink echoed between them. "Do your job, Lily." The younger woman swallowed hard, then nodded quickly, grabbing a tray of drinks and stepping away. Alone now, Amelia let out a slow, shaky breath. She needed to regain control. She needed to do something. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew control was already slipping through her fingers. The hum of the jet engines filled the cabin, but the usual comfort of their steady rhythm did nothing to settle Amelia's nerves. She moved through the galley with forced precision, stacking glasses, adjusting trays, anything to keep her hands busy. But the tension still clawed at her, curling around her spine, making it impossible to ignore the weight of what had just happened. She could feel it. The passengers, the crew, even the air itself, it had all shifted. Sophie still sat in her seat, perfectly poised, her phone resting lightly against her palm. She wasn't scrolling, wasn't texting, just holding it, waiting. The businessman across the aisle, still mildly amused, stole glances in her direction every so often. Amelia inhaled sharply, straightened her shoulders, and stepped back into the cabin. She needed to move past this, to regain some semblance of control. She stopped beside an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Tanner, frequent travelers who always booked the same seats near the front. They were the kind of passengers Amelia could count on. Polite, predictable, appreciative. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice smooth, practiced. Mrs. Tanner smiled politely, her fingers idly adjusting the silk scarf around her neck. "Quite the eventful boarding," she mused. Amelia forced a small chuckle. "Just a misunderstanding." Mr. Tanner didn't look convinced. His sharp blue eyes flicked toward Sophie, then back to Amelia. "Seemed more like a mistake." Amelia's stomach clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. "I was only ensuring all passengers were in their assigned seats." Mr. Tanner gave a slow nod, but his gaze remained steady. "Funny," he murmured. "I don't recall anyone asking to see her ticket." Amelia's fingers twitched at her sides. She wanted to argue, to explain, but what could she possibly say? She had made an assumption, one that had been so deeply ingrained in her, she hadn't even questioned it. And now? Now she was paying for it in a way she hadn't anticipated. She cleared her throat, offered a practiced smile, and moved down the aisle before the conversation could continue. Lily was at the other end, distributing drinks with careful, nervous efficiency. She wasn't making eye contact with Amelia, which only deepened the pit in Amelia's stomach. She kept walking, past the passengers who were trying to pretend they hadn't been listening, past the businessman who was still watching everything unfold like it was a particularly interesting TV drama. Then as she neared Sophie's seat, something changed. Sophie, still impossibly calm, lifted her phone and tapped the screen once. A moment later, a notification pinged through the aircraft's intercom system, a direct message from corporate. Amelia's heart stopped. Whatever it was, she knew this wasn't over, not even close. Amelia's pulse pounded in her ears as the notification chimed through the aircraft system. The sound was subtle, just a quiet tone, but to her, it was deafening. She forced herself to keep walking, to maintain the careful rhythm of her steps, but she felt the weight of every single pair of eyes on her back. She reached the galley, pretending to busy herself with the drink cart, but her hands trembled as she adjusted the glasses. Lily hovered nearby, glancing at her with hesitant concern. "Amelia," Lily started cautiously, "was that—" "I don't know." Amelia cut her off, her voice sharper than she intended. Lily flinched slightly, but nodded, stepping back. She wasn't going to push, but Amelia could feel the unspoken question lingering in the air. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. It was probably nothing. A routine update from corporate, maybe a reminder about turbulence, a note about flight schedules, something mundane, something harmless. But deep down, she knew better. Sophie hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to argue or threaten. She had simply waited. And now Amelia was standing here, her stomach twisting, waiting for the fallout. A quiet ding from her earpiece made her flinch. The captain's voice came through, steady and unreadable. "Amelia, I need you in the cockpit." Her throat tightened. She nodded, though no one could see her, and quickly made her way to the front. Every step felt heavier, the invisible pressure growing with each passing second. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. Captain Howard was already looking at her, his expression unreadable. But it was the co-pilot, a younger man with sharp eyes, who turned the screen toward her. One email, one sender, corporate. The subject line was brief. "Urgent, passenger incident report." Her stomach turned to ice. Howard folded his arms. "Would you like to explain why the owner of this airline just lodged a formal complaint against you?" For the first time in her career, Amelia had no words. Amelia's breath came shallow and uneven. The words on the screen blurred for a second before snapping back into focus. "Urgent passenger incident report." It was real. It was happening. Howard's gaze was unreadable, but there was something in it that sent a fresh wave of panic through her. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably. "You're aware of who Sophie Caldwell is, right?" Amelia's silence was answer enough. Howard exhaled, rubbing his temple before leveling his stare at her. "She's not just a passenger, she owns this airline." The words hit like a physical blow. Amelia felt the ground beneath her tilt, her stomach twisting into knots. The weight of what she had done settled deep in her chest. A second ding from the intercom, another message. Howard glanced at it, then turned back to Amelia, his expression now tinged with something unexpected, pity. "She's requested a meeting with corporate as soon as we land," he said, "and she's asked that you be present." Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. There was no yelling, no public humiliation, no immediate consequences. Just those quiet, measured steps, each one bringing her closer to an ending she couldn't predict. The silence stretched. Then a small, almost imperceptible vibration against her wrist, her smartwatch. A new email notification. She swallowed hard and looked down. One new message from Sophie Caldwell. No subject, no introduction, just a single line. Not every mistake has to end a career, but some do. Amelia's fingers curled into a fist. She didn't know if it was a warning, a second chance, or a final verdict, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again.